All right, you're live now.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي رب يسر ولا تعسر وتمم بالخير وبك نستعين يا فتاح اللهم وفقنا لما تحب وترضى رب زدني علما. So inshallah we'll continue with the comparative study of Surah Taha. And today I'll be talking about a very famous story both in the biblical literature and in the Holy Quran, which can be referred to as the Harun alayhi salam and the golden calf. In the Quran, this story is covered partly in Surah Al-Araf, and there are 19 verses in Surah Taha from 80 to 98, which give us a very detailed account of it. In Torah, it is mentioned in the book of Exodus. The entire chapter 32 deals with this story, and there are 35 verses. But I will not be going through all those 35 verses. I will just select some of them. But we will look at the entire section in the Surah Taha related to this incident. There are some misconceptions that Quran wants to clarify. So we'll be talking about both the Quran and Torah side by side. So now we'll talk about the background from the Holy Quran after the Bani Israel leave Egypt. This is mentioned in the first two verses, 80 and 81. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, Ba'da a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Ya Bani Israel, qad anjaynakum min aduwikum wa wa'adnakum janib al-tur al-aymana wa nazzalna alaykum al-manna was-salwa. Kulu min tayyibati ma razaqnakum wa la tadghaw fihi fayahilla alaykum ghadabi wa man yahlil alayhi ghadabi faqad hawa. O you children of Israel. Israel is the name of Yaqub alayhi salatu wasalam, as you know. And Yaqub alayhi salatu wasalam had 12 children, and they all became, you can say, the fathers of the 12 tribes of the house of Israel. One of the tribes was Levites. And I want you to remember this thing. We delivered you from your enemy, that is the Pharaoh and his army, and we made a covenant with you on the right side of Mount Sinai. And we sent down to you manna and quails, which is the food which was given to Bani Israel, saying, eat of the good things we have provided for your sustenance, but commit no excess therein, lest my wrath, my anger, should justly descend on you. So if you look at the word ghadabi, you can connect it with maghdubi alayhim. And those on whom descends my wrath do perish indeed. Now, the Bani Israel were in Egypt. They were enslaved by the pharaohs after a few years after Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam had passed away. And according to some scholars, the time period between Musa alayhi salatu wasalam and Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam was close to 480 years. So Bani Israel were in slavery for more than 4 centuries. During that period of time, there were several generations that came and went. And the generation that Musa alayhi salatu wasalam and Harun alayhi salatu wasalam were dealing with were slaves. They have spent their entire life in slavery. And the mind of a slave is very different from the mind of a free man. And this is a point to be remembered as to why Bani Israel did what they did. Now, which sea did they cross? The Quran only mentions Al-Bahr. In the Torah, the phrase used is Yam Saf. Yam, Y-A-M, Yam means water. Yam is in Arabic as well. The word Saf has been rendered as red. So it's oftentimes mentioned as Red Sea. But then in the 11th century, so you can say after thousands of years, someone from the rabbinic literature mentioned that Yam Saf doesn't actually mean Red Sea because the word Saf means reed. So it was a sea of reeds. And I don't have any knowledge of geography or archaeology to tell you exactly where it was, although you can find the references, but there is no real historical evidence outside of the scriptures. And in one of my talks, I mentioned to you that the history that we talk about is from the scripture, and we as Muslims believe in the history given to us by the Quran. The Jews believe in the history which they have carried over the centuries, as mentioned in the Torah. The archaeologists want to find archaeological evidence. And this is not the concern of this talk, this series of talk. We will focus on what the scripture says. So they had crossed, whether it was the Red Sea or a sea of reeds, into the desert of Sinai. And it was a desert. There was no vegetation. There were no trees. There was no water. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided a sustenance for Bani Israel out of His mercy, and He gave them certain commands. First one was Kulu min tayyibati ma razaqnakum. So eat from the pure things that we have given you. So tayyib is important. And then they were asked not to transgress in anything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't mention wala tadghaw in what? Don't transgress in what? Now you can imagine that tadghaw means is a generic term. Don't do to any extremes. Because if you cross the boundaries set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you qualify for the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whoever Allah is angry with, he will perish. So this was you can say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding them of His favors upon them. Ya Bani Israel, uskuru ni'mati allati an'amtu alaykum. Many of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many of the ni'mah were given to Bani Israel, and here it was their means of sustenance. They could not have survived. Nobody could have survived in a desert without food and without water, without shade as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually made the clouds go over them as well. Despite this, if they transgress, then it means that they will be denying the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon them. And as a result, they become qualified for the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it was a warning as well to them. And we'll say that this is what happened. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is the style of the Quran, that the wa'd and wa'id come together. The warning and good news come together. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, wa inni laghafaru liman taba wa amana wa amila salihan summa ihtada. But without doubt, I'm also He that forgives again and again. So Ghaffar is translated as somebody who forgives again and again, to those who repent. So repentance is the first step towards forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second is amana. Here it will mean they renew their iman, and then they follow it by doing good deeds. Who in fine are ready to receive true guidance. So they will be the one who will receive the true guidance. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks Musa alayhi salatu wasalam to go to the Mount of Sinai, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give him, according to the Torah, the 10 commandments, which were written on the tablets of Torah. Quran also mentions the tablets, and the 10 commandments are also mentioned in the Quran, actually, in a way. Musa alayhi salatu wasalam actually rushes before the appointed time. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks him this question, Wama ajalaka an qawmika ya Musa. So when Moses was up on the mount, Allah said, what made thee hasten in advance of thy people, O Moses? Now, this has been interpreted in more than one way. One way is that Musa والسلام, was supposed to take his people with him, and he rushed ahead of the people. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked him, although he knows everything, that what made you come ahead of your people? So Musa والسلام, says, قَالَهُمْ أُولَٰئِ عَلَىٰ عَصْرِي وَأَجِلْتُ إِلَيْكَ رَبِّ لِتَرْضَىٰ. He replied, behold, they are close on my footsteps, which means they are also coming. I hasten to thee, O my Lord, to please thee. But there is another explanation, which is given by the intellectuals of the Quran. They mention that Musa alayhi salatu wasalam came to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ahead of the appointed time. It's not that Bani Israel were supposed to go with him. He was called alone to go to the mount. But he should have waited for a little while. And the reason, as I mentioned earlier, that Bani Israel, the generation of Bani Israel that was with Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, was born and brought up in an atmosphere of slavery. They were never free thinkers. They had seen idolatry in Egypt. Monotheism was very new to them. They needed a leader to stay with them for a while. So again, the second group of scholars mentioned that this is a reference by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, O Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, you should have stayed with your people for a little while longer, so that they get used to worshipping me only and not worshipping anyone else. But Musa alayhi salatu wasalam gave a reason. وَأَجِلْتُ إِلَيْكَ رَبِّ لِتَرْضَىٰ. That, oh Allah, I came to you early to please thee. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them what has happened while he was away. قَالَ فَإِنَّا قَدْ فَتَنَّا قَوْمَكَ مِنْ بَعْدِكَ وَأَدَّلَهُمُ السَّامِرِي. And Allah said, we have tested your people in your absence. The Samri has led them astray. Who was Samri? Most of the talk that I will be giving today will be focused on Harun alayhi salatu wasalam and summary. And there is a reason you will find it, inshallah, as we progress. Now, we have to explain the Quran from the Quran. This is as I mentioned to you at the very beginning of this series, that there are different types of tafsir. The most common and the most reliable, the safest as well, tafsir is tafsir bil riwayah, where you explain the Quran, based upon the hadith, based upon the statements of the Sahaba and the scholars who came afterwards. The other tafsir is tafsir bil rai, and I've explained to you in detail, so I will not go into that. So here we will be explaining these verses by reference to the Quran. So first we will look at verses 92 and 93 from Surah Al-Baqarah. وَلَقَدْ جَاءَ وَلَقَدْ جَاءَكُم مُوسَى بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ ثُمَّ اسْتَخَذْتُمُ الْعِجْلَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ وَأَنْتُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. And Moses came unto you with clear proofs of Allah's sovereignty. And what are those proofs? Those bayyinat. We have the staff of the rod of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. We have the Yad Beda, the white hand. The many plagues came to the Bani Israel, to the people of Pharaoh, and they used to come to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness, and those plagues would be removed. So the scholars mentioned that there were actually 9 signs which came, which Bani Israel were witness to. So there were clear proofs which they had seen with their own eyes. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, yet while he was away, which means when he went to the Mount of Tur, you chose the calf for worship and you were wrongdoers. So here the story is not mentioned in detail. In verse number 93, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds them, وَإِذْ أَخَذْنَا مِيثَاقَكُمْ وَرَفَعْنَا فَوْقَكُمُ الطُّورَ خُذُوا مَا آتَيْنَاكُمْ بِقُوَّةٍ وَاسْمَعُوا قَالُوا سَمِعْنَا وَعَصَيْنَا وَأُشْرِبُوا فِي قُلُوبِهِمُ الْعِجْلَ بِكُفْرِهِمْ قُلْ بَئْسَ مَا يَأْمُرُكُمْ بِهِ إِيمَانُكُمْ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Remember that when we took a covenant from you and we lifted the Mount of Tur over your head, saying, take what we have given you firmly and listen to our commandments. You replied, we have heard, but we will not obey. So much was the love of the calf in their hearts due to their unbelief. O Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, tell them, if you are real believers, then why does your faith prompt you to do such evil? So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually addressing the Jews during the time of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in Medina by reminding them of what their seniors had done. Now, there is some difference of opinion about this incident, that when did this actually happen? Did Musa alayhi salatu wasalam go to the Mount of Tur twice? One is that when the people said that we won't believe in you until we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with our own eyes. And they went, and it seemed to them that the Tur will be actually overcoming upon them, will be falling upon them. They had fainted and they were brought back to life with the dua of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. Some scholars, in fact, many scholars think that the two events are actually the same one, except for a minority who said that they are two different incidents. This incident that we are reading in Surah Al-Baqarah is different from the incident mentioned in Surah Taha, where Musa alayhi salatu wasalam alone went. And again, Allah knows best. Surah Al-A'raf has also given some details of this story. So again, we have to combine these verses of the Quran to come up with a comprehensive concept. So Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 148, وَاتَّخَذَ قَوْمُ مُوسَى مِنْ بَعْدِهِ مِنْ حُلِيِّهِمْ إِجْلًا جَسَدًا لَهُ خُوَارٌ أَلَمْ يَرَوْا أَنَّهُ لَا يُكَلِّمُهُمْ وَلَا يَهْدِيهِمْ سَبِيلًا اتَّخَذُوهُ وَكَانُوا ظَالِمِينَ. In his absence, which means the absence of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, the nation of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam made an image of a calf for worship from their jewelry. We will discuss that in detail, inshallah, which produced a moving sound. Did they not see that it could neither speak to them nor give them the guidance? Yet they took it for worship and became wrongdoers. Now, a similar theme comes in the Quran several times when the Prophet ﷺ was having a dialogue with the Quraysh, that they were reminded, just like Ibrahim ﷺ reminded to his people when he broke the idols, that the idols that you're worshipping have no ability to talk to you. They cannot give you any kind of guidance. How could you make something with your own hands and then take it as your God? And how does it come? There is a human psychology here. The psychology comes from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Darda mentioned, and Nabi ﷺ, قَالَ حُبُّكَ الشَّيْء يُعْمِي وَيُسِمْ. The Prophet said that your love for something makes you blind and makes you deaf. Which means that if you, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, that the love of the calf, the love of idolatry was put into their hearts like water is put into them. They are drinking from it. So their love for idolatry had made them totally blind They couldn't, even though they had seen the bayyinat of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, they couldn't understand it. What you say? They couldn't hear it. The verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were being recited to them. And Nabi of Allah, Rasul of Allah, Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, was talking to them, telling them, and they would not hear it. So this is the psychology of a human being, particularly in the slaves who just take their life as granted. They never try to rise. This happened in history in the Hindus as well. They had this the level of the caste system, that those at the bottom were untouchables, and they took it for granted until only very recently, when after with the First and the Second World War, nationalism came, which led to the fall of the colonization, and independent nations came into being. At the same time, it also led to an individual awareness that people would say, don't I have my eyes to see? Don't have my ears to hear? Why do I have to accept the status quo that I've been born a slave, or I've been born at the lower level of the caste system, and I should spend my entire life like this? Don't have any right? So this is when people come out of slavery, that their mind can also become free, but it takes time for that to happen. Now, this is also continuing with the Surah Al-Araf. لما سار موسى عليه الصلاة والسلام ببني إسرائيل بعد هلاك فرعون وافوا على قوم يقفون على أصنام لهم قالوا يا موسى اجعل لنا إلها كما لهم آلهة قال إنكم قوم تجهلون إن هؤلاء متبر ما هم فيه وباطل ما كانوا يعملون. The first is actually an explanation of these verses, that when Musa عليه الصلاة والسلام left at night with the Bani Israel after the Pharaoh and his armies were drowned, they passed by a nation that was worshipping their idols, which they had. So they actually tell Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, "O Moses, make for us a god, even as they have gods." And he said, "Innakum qawmun tajhalun." You are a folk who know not, which means that you are still living in your period of darkness, in your period of ignorance. You have seen all these signs. You have crossed the sea without doing anything. You have been saved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and still you want to worship an idol? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in verses Al-Araf 138 and 139 mentioned, وَوَعَدَهُ رَبَّهُ ثَلَاثِينَ لَيْلَةً. This is an explanation. وَوَعَدَهُ رَبَّهُ ثَلَاثِينَ لَيْلَةً ثُمَّ اتْبَعَ لَهُ أَشَرًا فَتَمَّتْ لَهُ 40 لَيْلَةً أن يصومها الليل والنهار فسار موسى عليه الصلاة والسلام مبادرا إلى الطور فاستخلف على بني إسرائيل أخاه هارون. So this is from a traditional tafsir given by Zamakhshari of these verses, that once Bani Israel were settled, or not even settled, they were in the desert of Sinai. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took a promise from Musa alayhi salatu wasalam for 30 nights, and then he added 10 more. So he made it 30. And during those 40 nights, Musa alayhi salatu wasalam was to fast day and night. Now, this is again from a tafsir. And Musa alayhi salatu wasalam rushed to the Tur, to the mountain, that is before his appointed time, and he made Harun alayhi salatu wasalam the Khalifa. When Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would leave, when he would go to a ghazwa, he would appoint somebody to be the Khalifa in his place. Khalifa actually means a deputy. So we know that Abdullah bin Maktoum radiallahu ta'ala was also asked to be uh, the leader of the people after when the Prophet ﷺ and his people had gone on ghazwa. So here Musa alayhi salatu wasalam appoints his brother Harun to be his Khalifa. And وَكَتَبْنَا لَهُ فِي الْأَلْوَاحِ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ مَوْعِظَةً وَتَفْصِيلًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that we inscribe for him upon tablets all kind of instructions and details of everything. According to the Torah, these were the 10 commandments which were given to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. And there is a debate whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wrote himself, or whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dictated it to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, and he wrote it. If we look at وَكَتَبْنَا لَهُ, we wrote it down. But the translators say we inscribed for him. And again, in what way? Only Allah knows. And then the instruction was, فَخُذْهَا بِقُوَّةٍ. Even when Yahya alayhi salatu was given, the similar words come over there. Hold tightly, hold with strength, which means this is the law that has been given to you. You cannot ignore this law. You have to follow this law with everything that you can do. وَمُرْ قَوْمَكَ يَأْخُذُوا بِأَحْسَنِهَا. And also, which means the Prophet is the first one The recipient of the wahi is the first one on whom the law applies. And then he communicates it to his community. So, وَمُرْ قَوْمَكَ يَأْخُذُوا بِأَحْسَنِهَا, and tell your people to follow them according to the best of their abilities. This is a grace, this is a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ that obey Allah as much as you can within your ability. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not overburden anybody without his ability. But if you look at it, for the Prophet, the command is فَخُذْهَا بِقُوَّةٍ, and the commandment for his people is يَأْخُذُوا بِأَحْسَنِهَا, which means the responsibility on the Rasul is much heavier. And the Sa'urikum Dar al-Fasiqin, and say, I will show you the way the equitas go. The literal translation is, soon I shall show you the homes of the transgressors. But I like Muhammad As's translation, which is more meaningful, that I will show you the way the equitas and iniquitous shall go, which means that, O Musa, alayhi salatu wasalam, I am giving you these tablets. I have them inscribed for you, or you can say, I have written for you all kinds of nasiha and details of what you need of the law. You follow the law and you tell the people to follow it to the best of their ability, but I'm already telling you that they will fall short. So this is the way that they will go. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything. Now we come back to the Surah Taha. We are still studying this event from the Quran. I don't know if we'll be able to complete it today from the Torah or not, but I will try. فَرَجَعَ مُوسَى إِلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ غَضْبَانًا آسِفًا. So Musa alayhi salatu wasalam returned to his people with two feelings, two emotions. One emotion is ghadban. It's a isma mubalagha. He was extremely angry because his people had disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They had committed the worst sin that one can imagine. Inna shirk ala dhulmun azim. They had committed that shirk. And he had a feeling of sadness, asifa. So both emotions were playing on him. The Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put ghadbana first before asifa, which means that the anger was before the sadness. The element, the emotion of anger was much higher. And we know from the hadith of from the Prophet ﷺ as well that the Prophet ﷺ was not an angry person. But when it came to the matter of deen, he would show anger as well where it was justified. So when he comes, Musa ﷺ comes to his people, he says, Qala ya qawmi. He still addresses them, oh my people. And this comes in the stories of the prophets again and again and again, that even though their qawm is ridiculing them, his qawm is disobeying him, his qawm is denying the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the prophets still continue to address them, Ya Qawmi. They do not detach themselves from their people. My people, my people, my people. So, Alam yaidkum rabbukum wa'dan hasana. Has your Lord not made a good promise, a handsome promise to you? Afatala alaykumul ahdu. Did then the promise seem to you long in coming? Am aradtum an yahilla alaykum ghadabun min rabbikum fakhlaqtum mu'idi. Or did you desire that wrath should descend from your Lord on you, and so you broke your promise to me? He had taken a promise. Allah had taken a promise from them. And he's saying that, why did you do it? Didn't you know that that Allah will become angry to you? Or was it your desire to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now they say, they are giving their defense. They said, we broke not the promise to you as far as lay in our power. Now they are saying we were helpless, we were powerless. We did something wrong, but it was beyond our control. What was beyond their control? We were made to carry the weight of the ornaments of the whole people. Now, our historians mention, commentators mention that Bani Israel, the women of Bani Israel, had borrowed some ornaments from the Egyptian women to wear on the day of celebration, which is the Yom Zina. And then they were made to flee. So they did not have the time to return those ornaments to them. So they were carrying those ornaments from them. And we threw them into the fire, and that was what Samri suggested. We'll talk a lot more about Samri, inshallah, in the next few verses. So here, they are saying that we did it, We did not do it. So basically, first, I didn't do it. Someone else told me to do it. So they are putting the blame now on Samri as if to exonerate themselves. So what did Samri do? فَأَخْرَجَ لَهُمْ إِجْلًا جَسَدًا لَهُ خُوَارٌ فَقَالُوا هَذَا إِلَهُكُمْ وَإِلَهُ مُوسَى فَنَسِيَ. Then he brought out of the fire before the people the image of a calf, or the shape of a calf. It seemed to low, I mean, it seemed to produce a sound. Now, some of our scholars mentioned that the idol that Samri had made for them, it had some minute holes in it. So when the air or the wind would blow through it, it would create a sound. And these Bani Israel, they just ascribe divinity without thinking that where the sound is coming from. And faqalu, they said. Now the scholars of al-Mufassirin mentioned that not everybody was an idolater. And if we read the Torah, 3,000 people were subsequently killed. So it seems like not everybody participated in it. So when this Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says faqalu, they said, it means some people said, not everybody. So some people whose mind was already enslaved, who were already given to idolatry, who were with Samri, they told the others, Hada ilahukum wa ilahu Musa, that this is your God and the God of Musa Fanasiya. Now, who forgot? Fanasiya means he has forgotten. So one way of explaining it is that Musa wasalam, Ma'azallah, forgot that the God that he had gone to meet on Mount was actually not the God Ma'azallah again, but this calf is the God that Musa has forgotten. Ma'azallah. That kind of a thing. But Muhammad Asad and some other scholars mention, including the Makshri as well, the Fanasiya is referring to Samri. That Samri forgot that who is the real God. Or Samri made them forget. Or the people forgot. So again, different explanations are given. Now, Afala Yarona, this is Allah's comment. Afala Yarona, Allah yarju ilayhim qalam wala yamliku lahum daram wala naf'a. They not see that it could not return them a word, which means if they talk to that God, which they think was God, he would not respond to them, and that it had no power either to harm them or do them good. So this is something they have created. They have seen their own jewels getting melted, getting molten into the pit of the fire which Samri had dug, and then it had come out of it as in the form of a mold. It had no ability to speak. It had no ability to cause any harm. It had no ability to give any benefit. And yet they couldn't see it. That's the intellectual argument. وَلَقَدْ قَالَ لَهُمْ هَارُونُ مِنْ قَبْلُ. This is an important part. This is where there is a point of departure between the Quran and the Torah. وَلَقَدْ, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَلَقَدْ, we have to believe in it. It means Allah is taking an oath that truly, indeed, Harun had already told them. So Harun alayhi salatu wasalam had no part in making that idol. وَلَقَدْ قَالَ لَهُمْ هَارُونُ مِنْ قَبْلُ يَا قَوْمِ. And again, his address is my people. إِنَّمَا فُتِنْتُمْ بِهِ. When they had made this idol for themselves, Harun alayhi salatu wasalam, before Musa alayhi salatu wasalam had reached, had already addressed his people, my people, you have been put into a fitna. You are being tested. This is not right. وَإِنَّ رَبَّكُمُ الرَّحْمَنُ. Your Rabb is not this. Your Rabb is Ar-Rahman. That even he's using this sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ar-Rahman, to tell them that although you have committed the gravest of sins, the shirk, still Allah, your Rabb, is still Ar-Rahman. He can still forgive it. How? Fattabi'uni. First is follow me. Second, wa'atiu amri. Now the scholars have looked at it, this verse, in a much wider sense. And actually, I gave a khutbah only on this verse to talk about the role of a prophet. What is the role of a prophet when his people are not listening to him? First is he still has to stay with his community, not detach him, and he still address them in a polite way, Ya Qawmi, or my people. Second is not blame them directly. You did something wrong. What is he saying? You have been put into a test. You have been put into a trial. He's giving them some breathing space so that they will not turn away from him. Then he's reminding them of who is their Rabb. And then he's reminding them that he is the most merciful, which means come back. How can you come back? Fattabi'uni. So ittiba of Rasul is mandatory. This is very important. Ittiba of Rasul is mandatory, and obey my commands. Now, there is two words are being used. One is derived from ittiba, the other is ita'a, and the two are different. He's not saying fattabi'uni fi amri. He's saying wa atiu amri. So itaat is where a prophet, for us, the Prophet ﷺ, when he commands us to do something, it is his amr, and obedience is mandatory. This is itaat. Ittiba is even in matters where the Prophet ﷺ did not say do this thing, but we know that he did a thing certain way. If we do it because he's our role model, then we get the reward. The reward is in kuntum tuhibbunallah fattabi'uni yuhibbukumullah wa yaghfir lakum dhunubakum. That if you follow my role model, if you follow my sunnah, even though I have not ordered you, then Allah will love you and he will forgive you. So if you look at this one verse only, it's a khutbah of Harun alayhi salatu wasalam. It's a one-liner khutbah. But what depth is in it? How many things he's actually telling them in just one sentence. Ya qawmi, innama futintum bi, inna rabbukumur rahman, fattabi'uni wati wamri. 5 points. Now, how do they respond? How do they respond? قالوا لن نبرح عليه عاكفين حتى يرجع إلينا موسى. They are disobeying the Prophet now. They had said, we will not abandon this cult and we will devote ourselves to it until Musa alayhi salatu wasalam returns to us. So you can see, if we read the Torah, the Exodus, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, before Musa alayhi salatu wasalam came back, he told him they are a stiff-necked people. And I've listened to the Jewish explanation of those parts, and they themselves acknowledge that Bani Israel rebelled against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were a rebellious people. This is coming from the Jews of today, who actually, when they read the Torah, they realize it, that there was something really wrong which was committed at that time. And Quran is also telling us the same thing. So now when Musa alayhi salatu wasalam comes, he first asks Harun. Why? Because he had made him the Khalifa. And I will tell you one of the meanings of the word Harun. What's the meaning of the word Harun? We'll come to that. فَقَالَ يَا هَارُونُ مَا مَنَعَكَ إِذْ رَأَيْتَهُمْ ضَلُّوا. So Musa alayhi salatu wasalam said to Harun, his brother, what kept you back? Which means, why you did not prevent them when you saw that they were doing something wrong? Which means it was your responsibility to prevent them from doing it. Allah tattabi'ani af'asayta amri. That when they went wrong from following me, then did you disobey my order? Now here, Musa alayhi salatu wasalam is the senior prophet. And when he made Harun alayhi salatu wasalam his Khalifa, Harun alayhi salatu wasalam is bound to follow him, to follow whatever instructions were given. And obviously one has to understand from the style of the Quran that Musa alayhi salatu wasalam also had a feeling that Bani Israel will do something wrong in his absence. And he wanted Harun alayhi salatu wasalam to stop them from doing it. So now he's not cross-examining his Qawm, he's asking his Khalifa Harun alayhi salatu wasalam. Now Harun alayhi salatu wasalam, and this is not mentioned over here, but it's mentioned that Musa alayhi salatu wasalam held Harun alayhi salatu wasalam's beard. So he said, Qala ya ibn ummi. Now here, when Harun alayhi salatu wasalam is standing in front of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, his brother Harun is older, and Musa alayhi salatu wasalam is of a higher status, because he was the one given the prophethood before Harun alayhi salatu wasalam. And he's holding his beard in front of his people. How is he responding? If somebody holds my beard, I will start fighting with him. But he says, Ya ibn ummi. He appeals to him, son of my mother. The hearts can melt away when somebody talks to you and say, son of my mother. That relationship. Do not hold me. Do not grab my beard or my hair. Inni khashitu. I was afraid. This khashya is a natural khashya, natural fear. It's not that the prophets of Allah have that they just fear anybody. His khashya was not for his own life. And he mentions this. Inni khashitu an taqula farraqta baina bani Israel walam tarqub qawli. That if I had taken an action and if I had tried to prevent people by doing this by force, Bani Israel would divide into two groups. There will be one group who will be with me. There will be another group who will insist on rebelling. And this would have created a fitna. Al fitna to ashaddu min al qatl. It would have been even worse than qatl. It would have led to, you can say, civil disobedience. People will start to fight with each other. And then you would have said, Wallam taqub qali, that you did not follow my, you did not respect my word, which means that the instructions given by Musa alayhi salatu wasalam would have also included that, oh Harun, do not do anything that will divide Bani Israel in my absence. So for Harun alayhi salatu wasalam, a division in the community was not acceptable. He did not want a fitna. He did not want a brother killing a brother, a son killing his father, or father killing his son, and relatives killing with each other. He didn't want that. So division of community is something that must be avoided at all cost. So he is giving a very, very strong reason for why he did not take that step. So now Musa alayhi salatu wasalam's anger settles down. And now he's turning his attention to Samri. And again, he's not passing a judgment. This is something very important to understand, that Musa alayhi salatu wasalam is not, he's angry. We know Ghazban. He's also very sad. But he does not take a sword and start hitting people. He asks Harun alayhi salatu wasalam, and now he knows that Samri has done it. Samri is in front of him. He is again not giving a judgment against Samri. He wants to give Samri time to explain why he did it. He gives giving him a chance. So he said, Qala fama khatbuka ya Samri. They said, what is your case? Plead your case in front of me. There were no lawyers over there. Everybody has to speak for himself. There is a lot to be said about this, the verse that we will be reading, inshallah. I'll give you the tafsir bir riwaya, tafsir bir rai as well. He said, Qala basartu bima lam yubsiru bih. He said, I saw what they did not see. We'll talk about it in detail. فَقَبَسْتُ قَبْضَةً مِّنْ أَثَرِ الرَّسُولِ. So I took a handful from the footprint of the messenger. Now, if you look at the translation, in the parenthesis it mentioned, I picked up a handful of dust from the footprint of the messenger. And Abdullah bin Masud radiallahu ta'ala explains it, and we'll inshallah see that explanation as well. فَنَبَسْتُهَا. So I picked up dust from the footprint of the messenger. We'll talk about who's that messenger. And I threw it, which means I threw it into the calf, or I threw it into the pit where the golden ornaments and the silver ornaments were melting. فَكَذَلِكَ سَوَّلَتْ لِي نَفْسِي. Thus did my soul suggest to me. So now he is, in a way, accepting his responsibility. And if you look at it, there is no blame on Harun alayhi salatu wasalam that he participated in the making of a calf, which is a very important point because of what the Exodus mentions. And we have to read the Quran first from the Quran, so that we know the real background from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before we read anything from the Israelites or even from the Torah. So now Musa alayhi salatu wasalam is now giving a punishment to Samri. So he gives a punishment. He gives three types of punishments actually, Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. One is a punishment to Samri. Second is a punishment to the people who participated in idolatry. And the third is punishment for the calf itself. So three things come here. Qala fazhab. Musa alayhi salatu said, get out of here. Get thee gone. Which means now you are no longer with us. فَإِنَّ لَكَ فِي الْحَيَاةِ أَن تَقُولَ لَا مِسَاسَ. So your punishment in this life will be that you will say, touch me not. Now, what does touch me not mean? We will discuss it, inshallah. وَإِنَّ لَكَ مَوْعِدًا لَن تُخْلَفَهُ. And moreover, for a future penalty, you have a promise that will not fail. And the scholars mention that the future penalty, or the mu'id, is referring to the punishment in the hereafter. So he was given a punishment of, like you can say, solitary confinement. I will deliberate upon it later, inshallah. And the future punishment, the everlasting punishment, which will not fail you, which means it will strike you, and that's the punishment in the akhirah. And now he's telling him, Manzur ila ilahika alladhi dalalta alayhi akifa. And now look at the God that you had become a devoted worshipper of. We will melt it, certainly melt it in a blazing fire, and then scattered its ashes in the sea. And then he is addressing his entire community. Innama ilahukumullahu lazi la ilaha illa huwa wasi'a kulla shay'in ilma. That the God of you all is one Allah. There is no God but He. And as I mentioned last week about Yahweh, that it could mean La ilaha illallah, and Allah knows best. All things He comprehends in His knowledge. Because Allah had already told Musa والسلام, that this is what had happened in his absence through Allah's knowledge. So His knowledge had extended over everything. So this is where that story ends. And there are several points to ponder as we read through the Exodus. So I think that I will actually leave it for the next time because there is actually a lot to discuss. So we will have to discuss why was Musa والسلام, called to the Mount of Sinai? Who made a demand for the golden calf and why? Who made the golden calf? Who was Samri? What was Harun والسلام, role in that event? So actually there's a lot of material to cover, which I don't think that I will be able to cover in the time which is remaining. So inshallah, we'll discuss this not next week because next week's the holiday week, which will be taking off. And the following week is the 1st of January. So I'll be speaking with Imam Asif whether he wants me to continue to restart on the 1st of January or afterwards. And may Allah forgive me if I made any mistake. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولذكر الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.